Now available in paperback and Kindle, All About Marilyn. Learn all about the struggles of a faded former teen sitcom star in this absolutely fabulous 5-star screenplay. Get All About Marilyn in paperback and Kindle on Amazon.com today. In a previous video, I talked about Steven Spielberg's remake of West Side Story. Now, the main reason why this remake of West Side Story was made by Steven Spielberg was because your Steven Spielberg is a baby boomer, and because he's a baby boomer, he has fond memories of this film, which gives him great memories of his past. However, those memories are a part of a rose-colored reality that many baby boomers have, where they don't want to see the real damage that their generation has done to people in other communities. Now, many of your baby boomers want to make remakes of these classic films like West Side Story because they remember them fondly and because they fear their own mortality and know that their time on this earth is about to end. They want to reminisce fondly about those times where they sat in the movie theater and watched classic films like these. However, your West Side Story wound up failing at the box office, and the reason why it wound up failing is because when black and brown people look at the history of this film, they can see the racism that went on behind the scenes. Now, your West Side Story did not take place in the South Bronx like I thought, or Spanish Harlem. No, it took place in a neighborhood that no longer exists, San Juan Hill. Now, your San Juan Hill was a neighborhood formed by black Americans and your Puerto Ricans and people from the Caribbean back during the time of after the Spanish-American War. And after the Spanish-American War, many black soldiers, many Puerto Rican soldiers, and many people from the Caribbean, they came to this neighborhood to form a community. Now, this community was made up of tenements, and because your Robert Moses, the grand developer of the modern 20th century New York City, thought the neighborhood was a blight, what he did was he wound up trying to take most of the property of those tenements through eminent domain. And because he wound up taking all of the property through the policy of eminent domain, where the government compensates landlords by buying their property to redevelop an area, what they did was they wound up evicting hundreds of thousands of black, brown, and people from the Caribbean from their neighborhood, and then they went out here and demolished the entire community of San Juan Hill. And as they were demolishing the neighborhood of San Juan Hill, we saw them try to whitewash the whole sordid story with the creation of this musical West Side Story. Now, this West Side Story movie was nothing but propaganda to try to erase a historical tragedy. And this whole movie, when you start to really think about what happened to San Juan Hill, it just is one of the worst things that you could ever think about. Now, as they were demolishing San Juan Hill and evicting all of those black and brown and people from the Caribbean from their neighborhood, they were out here filming this movie to try to whitewash the history of San Juan Hill. And this movie, West Side Story, which is a supposed adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, shows us I believe, Hispanic girl or white girl, I don't know who it is, in love with a Hispanic man. And it's just a complete farce. But what is even worse is, again, the destruction of a black neighborhood where the Charleston originated and people like Thelonious Monk played jazz. They won't tell you about that side of the story as related to West Side Story. No, they want to erase that part of the history of West Side Story and then have you focused on this so-called classic romance that white boomers love so much, but they don't want to talk about the racism that led to the destruction of an entire community of black, brown, and people from the Caribbean's neighborhood and the culture that came from that neighborhood. Now, your Robert Moses said that he was trying to improve the quality of the area, but after they demolished San Juan Hill, a working class neighborhood, what was constructed wasn't housing for the middle class. No, what was constructed was Lincoln Center, a playground for the wealthy elite. And your Lincoln Center stands on the ashes of a once working class black community, and your Lincoln Center is now in the place where many black families once lived. So that's what your Steven Spielberg doesn't want to talk about as related to West Side Story, a movie where we can see demolished buildings and demolished lots in that neighborhood as the movie was being filmed. They were sitting there filming this piece of revisionist history, all while they were tearing down a predominantly black and brown community. And they don't want to talk about that part as related to the history of West Side Story. No, they were saying that they were out here improving the so-called urban blight. And as they were out here so-called improving the urban blight, what was happening was we were seeing the complete erasure of a neighborhood, and we were seeing the complete erasure of another black community. Because this isn't the first black community that was erased. No, Greenwich Village was erased by using the same policies, and Central Park, where Central Park stands, another predominantly black community, was erased as well. And most people wouldn't know that these were predominantly black neighborhoods in some of what people call the wealthiest parts of New York City, with the most expensive real estate, unless they did some research on the history of New York City. No, most people would be caught up in the whole spectacle of this musical West Side Story and thinking about the memories of that musical the way that baby boomers are doing right now, caught up in their nostalgia of the past, but not thinking about the history of the lives they destroyed so that they could have their wonderful memories. And when I look at this remake of West Side Story, it is a major slap in the face to all of those black and brown and people from the Caribbean who came to this country looking for a better life and an opportunity at the American dream. But instead of getting their opportunity at the American dream, they got it taken away by your Robert Moses, who wanted to go out here and build a playground for the wealthy elite. And those people wound up having to take everything that they worked for and try to start all over again. But all people wanted to do is go to the theater and talk about the West Side Story, the baby boomers, like it was some grand form of entertainment. But it wasn't entertaining for all of those people who lost their lives and had to pick up and start all over again, and lost their homes, all because the wealthy wanted to turn Manhattan into their own personal playground. And this is one of the reasons why I believe that karma came back to your Steven Spielberg, because as he was trying to reminisce about the past in his attempt to avoid having to deal with his own mortality, we see this movie failing at the box office. And this movie failed at the box office, I believe, because you're trying to take a 60-year-old story from another era, and you're trying to take this 60-year-old story and trying to reminisce about a past which really was a complete lie, because the past you're trying to reminisce did a lot of damage to a lot of black and brown people. And this movie was filled with a lot of racist stereotypes, especially about Latinos. Now, this movie, again, this remake, is an insult, as I see it, to many members of the Latino community, because it takes us back to a time that your whites can go out here and perpetuate their stereotypes aggressively, while passively talking about diversity and inclusion. But when I look at the original West Side Story, it was one of the most racist films I have ever seen. because as somebody who has lived in a predominantly Hispanic part of the South Bronx, where I've seen Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Cubans, Mexicans, El Salvadorans, and Hondurans, and many others come to the community to build lives. I look at this film as an insult and an affront to the Hispanic community, and it just breathes brand new life into old stereotypes about Hispanics, and it's just a terrible film when you look at it in the context of history, especially when you think about all of the people who lost their lives and had their neighborhood completely destroyed. And you're going to sit there and try to tell me a story about this so-called love story between this white person and this Hispanic person, passively while aggressively destroying the very neighborhood that all of those people were living in. And you're going to think that this is going to be entertainment. That just shows how out of touch many of your baby boomers like your Steven Spielberg are, and how they really, because they see the world through the rose-colored lenses of a baby boomer, and because they think the world revolves only around them, they don't see how this film was just an absolute offense to members of the Hispanic community and even members of the black community, because you destroyed a neighborhood and then you want to celebrate the destruction of a neighborhood, and then you expect people to come out here and watch this movie where a neighborhood where people live no longer exists. That just shows how much hubris your Steven Spielberg and many in Hollywood have. You're going to expect people to come out and go see a movie where we see an entire neighborhood completely destroyed right in front of us, and you expect to get hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, that again just shows how out of touch they are as related to reality. And you're expecting people to come out and celebrate this musical, which is something I think no one would ever do, because who would celebrate having their neighborhood being gentrified out of existence to make the elitist playground known as Lincoln Center? I mean, who would go out here and spend $15 on that? Now, some people are saying that the movie failed because of things like the subtitles, like where some parts of the film are spoken in Spanish and there's no subtitles, and others are saying that it failed because of the feminist narratives. But I believe that this film failed because these Hollywood types are, again, because they fear their own mortality, are so detached from reality. They thought, making this remake of a movie from the early 1960s, which was, again, filled with racist stereotypes and just talks about celebrating the destruction of an entire community of black, brown, and people from the Caribbean, is entertainment. And that when people today, Hispanic people of today, look at this movie, they don't see it as entertaining in any way, shape, or form, because who would be entertained by watching a so-called love story between a, I believe, Hispanic man and a white woman? I mean, most people in the Hispanic community, they want to see Hispanic men with Hispanic women, and they're not really buying that today. In 2021 America, Hispanic men want to see stories about Hispanic women, and they want to see brown on brown love, just like black people want to see black on black love. And that's something that I believe was another thing that led to the movie not doing well, because as somebody who, again, has lived in the Hispanic community, I know that many Hispanics, they have their own media these days that they didn't have in 1961. They have their own networks that they didn't have in 1961. They create their own content. That was something that they didn't do in 1961. And when they look at West Side Story, you would see people in the Hispanic community, I believe, having to roll their eyes and suck their teeth at it. And they also rolled their eyes and sucked their teeth at the whole concept that Steven Spielberg was trying to push out here to promote the film, and that is talking about Latinx. And that whole Latinx concept, that is something many people in the Hispanic community I know frown on, because many people do not like that. They see it as a paternalistic statement by whites trying to win favor with Hispanics, and they really are insulted when you start talking about Latinx. I mean, Latinx is just like using the N-word in the black community, and Latinx is not, something that members of the Hispanic community see positively. So your Steven Spielberg was out here pushing Latinx and then pushing a story that was really negative towards Hispanics and showed the destruction of a Hispanic neighborhood, but he was expecting to get $300 to $500 million at the box office, not understanding that West Side Story is a part of a past that many in the Hispanic community and many in the black community find to be one of the most racist stories to ever grace the silver screen. Now, if your Steven Spielberg wasn't so afraid of his mortality, he would have gone out here and done a biopic on the late legendary wrestler Eddie Guerrero. Now, Eddie Guerrero is an icon in the Hispanic community. He's an icon in the wrestling community, and he is loved all over the world. And a movie about the late Eddie Guerrero and his rise to the top of wrestling, that movie would have made over $300 million within 2 weeks, I believe, because Eddie Guerrero's story is one that everybody knows today, and most kids today still love Eddie Guerrero. And this would have been a great opportunity to make a great film that would have been very appealing to the Hispanic community, because it would have elevated one of the great Hispanic icons to another level, and it would have told and shared his story with all of those for generations to come. That would have been the movie to make for me if I were running a movie studio, because I understand that if you want to sell a movie to the Hispanic community, you have to celebrate the icons of today, not try to create a remake of a movie that promotes paternalism and racism, yet it's called a classic among baby boomer whites who lived in a world where they were just completely oblivious to the everyday racism they were participating in, because West Side Story was them trying to, again, whitewash and revise history. And as they were attempting to whitewash and revise history, they were out here, again, passively talking about a musical, but aggressively going out here and whitewashing and promoting anti-black racism, anti-brown racism, anti-Caribbean racism, and erasing jazz culture, erasing the place that created the Charleston, erasing the musical history, and erasing so much, and then trying to make it look like, oh, this was a great musical, but this was a great big slap in the face to all of those communities that wound up having their history erased from the pages of American history. Now, if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to pick up some of my positive black fiction on the SJS Direct imprint, you can find many of those titles on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them on Smashwords, the iBook Store, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Counsel Vacation. Hell's aspiring angel takes on a social justice, social media mob looking to counsel her in this all-new E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Counsel Vacation in paperback and e-readers today.